This is a D6 Generation Pip. Bite-sized content for a busy gamer. Sometimes featuring Craig, sometimes featuring Russ.
Hey, what about me?
Oh yeah, and sometimes featuring Raef, Hollywood Granger.
Well, hello, welcome back, all you listeners. Good morning. I'm Raef Hollywood Granger. I'm here with Russ Wakeland.
I'm excited to be here, Raef, in your studio apartment situation with my lovely coffee you just freshly poured for me. So I'm feeling very it's coffee with Granger. It's Granger and a cappuccino. Except it's not. It's just black coffee.
Just black coffee.
You don't have cappuccinos here, Raef. You got to kick it up a notch, buddy.
I don't have cappuccinos. I don't have espresso either. But anyway, I'm super excited because we're here live.
So live in person.
I'm staring right
recording on
a
green fuzzy felt mat from the old GW days. The stuff that makes the little fuzzies come off in your fingers.
No, this one's good. This is the higher end.
Oh, high. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the good stuff for me.
I got the good stuff out. Yep. Yeah. But we got a special event here today for all you listeners. Russ has created a game, and
this is freaky. I'm a little freaked out. Right?
I can tell.
I'm not gonna lie.
I can tell from that introduction.
This is weird. Like it's anyway. Keep going. We'll talk more. I'm sure about all this. Crazy.
Oh yeah, I got tons of questions for you. So I know nothing about it. Russ asked me maybe a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago. He's like, Raef, I got some big news. I'd love to have a Raef and a Ruff segment. And I said, sure, and I'll ask all my Raefy questions. And so, yeah, how about without further ado, I'll jump right into it.
Yeah, go for it.
So, what did you create? What do you have here to show me?
Well, okay, so this is kind of a weird, circuitous way that this happened. And just to give listeners and you, Raef, a little more color on this, because I literally just said to Raef, like, hey, do you have time this month for us to get together and record? Because it turns out me and a few folks are launching a brand new game that I designed on Gamefound like next month. And would you want to talk to me about it? And Raef's like, yes. And how come you didn't tell me? So it's been very sort of on the down low. But how it started was back in 2018 now.
Okay.
A person came to me and said, hey, I've been listening to the D6 Generation for years. You review all these different games. It sounds like you talk about mulling mechanics. You understand all these mechanics of games. Have you ever thought about designing a game? And I was like, well, I not really, but it would be kind of fun to do. And he kind of said, well, these are some things. I have these 3 models, and can you make a game around these 3 dudes?
Huh.
And I was like, okay. And so I thought a lot about what kind of game I would want to make. And so to answer your question, which is what game are we launching? It really came down to the game genre I like the most. And I think we've talked about this on the show before. My absolute favorite genre is the one versus many dungeon crawl, right? Mm-hmm. The game like Descent and the original Doom and Star Wars Imperial Assault. Those games, one player plays the evil, overlord running the bad guys, and everybody else plays the heroes. Now, those games have a few drawbacks, though, and so one of them is that they are usually very complex to set up. There's lots and lots and lots of components. So you have to the person playing the dungeon master role or the overlord role. That person has to read the scenario, preset the scenario up, know a lot about that sort of stuff. And then also the other thing about it is that most of these games now have evolved thanks to the success of Gloomhaven now. Nearly entirely all those games are full co-op now. There aren't any really good one versus many dungeon crawling games. Oh. And so I thought, would it be possible to create a light, easy to set up one versus many dungeon crawl where within less than a minute you're set up, ready to play. And here's the most interesting part about it. I wanted it to be a way that the dungeon master, the person playing the role of the dungeon master, one thing that none of these games ever captured is that in a real role-playing game, the dungeon master doesn't actually know what's going to happen either. The dungeon master knows the layout of the dungeon, maybe, but there are some variants of role-playing where you can kind of randomly generate the dungeon as the dungeon master as the players play, and I wanted that element to it.
That's fascinating.
And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wouldn't it be cool if the hero players could control the dungeon as it was being built as much or influence it like the dungeon master? And what if the dungeon master or the overlord didn't know how it was all going to go? And so what if it was a competitive dungeon building game? What if there was a competition between the heroes and the dungeon master to get the dungeon layout in a way where it was either easier for the dungeon master to repel the heroes with kill zones and everything else, or it was easier for the heroes to find their objectives quickly before the dungeon master could get everything set up properly.
Wow.
And so that was sort of the impetus. And so the game we are launching next month is, we are calling it Grim Dark Dungeon Master. And the idea behind it is definitely taking inspiration from Grim Darkness, the idea of a grim dark fantasy. But it is also taking inspiration from that idea of a competitive dungeon building game where the hero players are working together against the human dungeon master player, the Grim Dark Dungeon Master. And his or her job is to try to protect these objectives, repel the heroes, while the heroes are trying to find those objectives and purge them before the dungeon master can repel them.
This is fascinating. Okay, this is exciting. So I'm really excited to now see how you've blended these
And I'm
concepts.
still in shock that this actually happened, because when we first started doing this, I was like, well, this is never going to happen, first of all. So I'm just going to make some fun rules.
Idea.
First of all, could the rules even be fun? Like at this point, and by the way, this was back in 2018. We first did the initial prototype.
Which is 4 years ago now.
Which was, which was a different genre and everything else. And I don't want to share any of that because who knows where this could all go. So I'm not at liberty to share all those sorts of things. But we've had several pivots along the way. But the core concept of the game has always remained. And one of the things that took us so long to get from those initial ideas to all the way was, as we started figuring out we had some of the mechanics, people started saying, this is actually fun, Wakeland. I'm like, is it really? Because I don't know.
Yeah.
And they're like, but we need better art. And this is something I kept saying. Like, for me, a good game with good rules is great, but a great game also has amazing components and amazing component quality and amazing art. Yeah.
You have a great rule set, but it's not quite as fun to play with little plastic discs that can represent
or not even, or just a bunch of very affordable tokens. Like,
or a paper map versus a nice linen board.
Yes. And so originally we were like, what if we made a very affordable little game that was kind of a fun little one versus many dungeon crawl? And then later we started realizing we think there's something here. And this needs the investment, the time, and the commitment to really being one of those A-list games with all top-notch components, top-notch art, top-notch sculpts, like things that people would look at and go, I would buy that game just for the models, but holy crap, the rules are fun too. And that was sort of our goal. Still remains to be seen if we nailed that. I think I'm really proud of what we've got here. I am really proud to put my name on it. I'm really proud to have it associated with all the different things I've been involved with, but I'm still nervous. I don't know. I mean, so far, everybody seems to like it, but there's so many things that can still be challenged on it. But I can't believe it this far anyway. I mean, it's just kind of shocking.
It is. I know what you mean when you create something and put it out there. It is a bit nerve-wracking, but we'll dive into that later. Let me get some more specifics, because you've been living this game for 4 years, but this is new to all of us listening. So I love this idea. So yes, you always are a fan of the one versus many.
Yep.
And I wanted to ask, first I want to put a capstone on it. So what we have is a dungeon crawl, traditional 1 versus 4 or 5. When you say many, is it 4 or 5?
So in this case, it's the core set, the initial version, is a 4-player game with 1 player taking the role of Grimdark Dungeon Master and the other 3 players taking the role of heroes.
Okay.
And the core game will come with 3 different heroes you can choose from that are all asymmetric, meaning they are all very different mechanics.
Okay.
I mean, the core way you play each hero is the same, but each hero has different abilities that are unique to that hero.
Yep.
We can get in all that. But then also, the game is very expandable. So the idea is it would be very easy to add different heroes. It would be very easy to have more than 4 players. You can also play with less than 4 players. You do always need 2. It's not a solo experience. It's not a co-op experience. And that was deliberate. I think there's a lot of great solo games out there. There's a lot of great co-op games out there. My favorite game, though, is the competitive sort of, screw your neighbor. There's one person trying to win against others. I also wanted the challenge of an asymmetric rule set, meaning that the Grimdark Dungeon Master's mechanics, completely different than the hero mechanics. All 3 heroes have roughly the same mechanics and different abilities, but the way the Grimdark Dungeon Master functions is completely different set of mechanics for that person's activities, which is sort of interesting. I want to see if I could balance that. So now you've also got, as a game designer, it's tricky. I can't even believe I just used my I just
title.
I feel like I can't call myself a game designer until I've actually had a game published. So we'll see. As a game designer wannabe, I will say, aspiring game designer. I think it's interesting to try to solve a problem where you have two different sets of mechanics, one for one player and another. And the other problem I think is interesting to solve is you need to design a game where three brains are against one brain, and the one brain has an equal chance to beat the three brains.
That was one of my questions.
Which is interesting.
But don't go there yet.
Okay.
So I want to talk some of the details of the game, but also some of your creative process.
Yeah.
And I'll share with you, I know what you mean about that feeling of it's hard to call yourself a game designer. And we've been humble followers as gamers, but I would encourage you to adopt that title because guess what? You designed a game. Whether one copy,
that's true.
Whether one copy sells or not, you are a game designer.
Oh, thank you.
I guess it remains to be seen if we put you into the halls of the.
Well, maybe I just can't have good game designer.
Right,
I can't get good. I can be bad game designer, failed game designer, but there is actually a game that's designed by me.
Designer.
That's fair.
And it's a title I've been working on. Russ, if you look over to your left, I have 2 guitar cases over there. I've played in 10 backyard barbecues. I've sang in front of people, and I still stumble over I'm a musician. And so I've been like trying to wear that mantle. So I share your thoughts on I'm not a musician / that's a guitar player.
Right.
I'm just a dude that owns a guitar.
Right.
So but people remind me, they're like, did you play the backyard barbecue? I'm like, I did. You were a guitar player. Anyway, so I share with you. I know what that is, but start wearing the mantle because it's well deserved, I'm sure. Okay, some details before I even look at components or anything.
Yeah.
I want to go back to.
By the way, we should say you haven't seen anything yet.
No, I've not seen.
So I've got it all here for Raef to look at live on the air with you guys. So you're going to hear his reaction at first, which I'm a little nervous about, quite frankly, because I hope you're very honest, Raef. Like I don't want you to
me.
Be like,
I'll be honest.
But yes, so keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want listeners to know, like, it's not like I showed Raef all of this. No. Raef's not played the game.
Not played the game.
And like literally, he only is known for about 2 or 3 weeks that this is actually a thing.
Yep.
And he has seen nothing about it. So Raef is completely clean on this.
Fresh eyes. I've not read a thing on it. I don't know a thing about it.
Right.
Let's do some more of the details first. Mm-hmm. So, and then we'll do creative. So, can people go buy it? Is it on the shelves? Let's talk about.
Not yet. So what we're doing is we are launching the Gamefound next month. So just for everybody knows, in case you listen to this late, right now it is September 3rd, 2022 when we're recording this, right? And the goal is to we're launching the Gamefound preview page today at noon. So by the time you hear this, the preview page is up. You can go watch the video of it. You can go see some elements of the game. And then on the goal is the end of September or first week in October. We're still working on the exact date to launch the actual Gamefound. And I think listeners know that Gamefound is sort of the board game specific version of Kickstarter. Which is really it's got a lot of cool features. Some of the most well funded board games lately have been on Gamefound. So
I just funded Robinson Crusoe.
Yep.
Fully kitted out on Gamefound.
Yes.
And I didn't know why. They've been fantastic.
Gamefound is a much better system, I think. Also, Kickstarter did a few things with NFTs about a year ago that rubbed people the wrong way. So a lot of people are looking for an alternative. We just found Gamefound to be so easy to use. There's the profit sharing model is a little stronger, so a lot of things I like about them. But again,
so on Gamefound preview page.
So it'll be on Gamefound.
For name of the board game again.
It's going to be Grim Dark Dungeon Master. So if you just start typing in Grim Dark, you'll find it. Grim Dark Dungeon Master is the name of the game, and it'll be there. We also have a Facebook page, and if you go to grimdarkgames.com, you will find us that way too. So a bunch of ways you can get there.
Okay. All right.
Raef is checking his phone now.
No, my phone's dinged. I hate being interrupted. Okay, so on the preview page, they'll be able to see the video and put visuals to all the things we're describing.
And so we're going to be adding over. So right now, the preview page is going to be very light, and between now and the launch of the Gamefound, we'll be adding more details. So if you follow the page, you'll be notified. Our plan is daily, pretty much, to be trickling out little information about the game to get more details. You're going to, of course, have a huge advantage, Raef, today because you're going to see much of the game all at once. Our listeners will have a big advantage also, which is partly to thank all of you guys, because if you had not supported this show and you had not listened so much and made this show as popular as it was, I would not have been approached and been saying like, because the only reason people think I can design a game is just because I've got so much exposure to games and I comment so much. There's this presumption that I know what I'm doing, which again, I think, to your point, Raef, we would not be this far if we hadn't play tested the heck out of it. A lot of people, like for example, right now, members of the group that's working on this are at Nova Con, which is a big 40K convention, and they're demoing the game right now for the first time anywhere.
Yeah, so exciting.
And so far, everybody's feedback has, according to the folks there, been insane. And I'm just so humbled and in shock. What makes me particularly proud of this is I wanted the game to be very accessible and easy to get to. And these are like hardcore 40K players at one of the most competitive tournaments in the United States. And they're like, this game is easy to get into, but also very deep and fun.
Yeah.
And that's exciting to me because I want the game to feel that way. And you can have a hardcore gamer play it and have fun, but then also be accessible for younger players or people who are less hardcore gamers to also be able to have fun with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get a couple things off on the table in case you're worried about it. You said earlier, Raef didn't know, and I don't care. Like, I'm so happy you came to me and you said, hey, Raef, would you interview me? I was very honored to be the person to do that. So I'm not sitting here being like, how come I wasn't a playtester or I didn't? Honest to God, I'm not thinking that way. So I'm so excited for you. And also, I got to say that I'm a little jealous in a way. I don't want to create a game, but I'm like, Craig's gotten his great opportunities from the show. Nicole's gotten her great opportunities. You've now got them. Like, I wonder what Raef's opportunity will be. Who knows? I don't know.
You never know. But you do your whole lawyer podcast and everything, and I would imagine that your skills there have come from and you do a lot of public speaking. And I'm also going to guess.
I do.
I know that I personally, in my other life, in my business life, I've become a much stronger public speaker in the last 10 to 12 years than I ever was prior to the show.
Yeah.
And I do think that just talking at a microphone for, at one point, like 4 hours a week is what we were doing for the show when we were in our biggest
heyday
time. That you learn a lot.
We do
Practice
learn
makes
a lot.
perfect, and I do think that our ability to be decent at public speaking, your ability to do that as a lawyer, I think a lot of that was informed by that too. So I would I would think that a lot of what you're doing today is informed by some of that.
I don't want to make it about me, but I wanted to blurt that out there in full candor. Yeah. And if anything, Russ, my business coaching podcast is worse because of the D6G because I think there's 4 people that listen to the business one. I'm so used to having a lot of ears on me that my ego gets inflated, and that's a whole nother story. Okay, so before we talk mechanics, okay, so Gamefound, when can they pledge? When
so
is it going to distribute?
So what we're doing now is we want to launch. We want to what's really exciting about the folks involved with this, which is really interesting, and again, I have to be, the folks involved with the manufacturing process and everything are amazing folks. They're the people that are behind the scenes in a lot of manufacturing in the gaming industry, but they don't like to be publicized.
Sure.
So these are folks that have done a lot of the cool metal challenge coins you've seen at various conventions. These are folks that have done amazing paintbrush work. They've done other board games, but they're not like a particular group of people that you would know. They're like the behind the scenes guys. Which again, I would never have access to except for the show, and they were fans of the show. So, what excites me about this, though, is the initial production quality version for version 1 that Raef's going to see today and get a chance to play a little bit today, that you will also see pictures of on the Gamefound page, that was actually produced by the factory that's going to produce the final game, which is very exciting because we get to see the parts, we get to see how the manufacturing is going to work, we can iterate on it. So most game folks don't have that capability to actually know the people who work the factory. Normally they kickstart their game, they design it, maybe they make a prototype with some other third party, or they built it themselves, and then they got to go find the game manufacturer, and then they got to figure it out. And they know what they're going to get, and then by the time it ships, they're like, yeah, we had hoped that it would be this way, but it didn't work out, we're sorry. Or we didn't calculate properly for shipping, or didn't figure out manufacturing costs. Because the people involved in this we are involved in the production process from beginning to end and every step in the middle. I am extremely confident that we are going to be able to get it out rapidly, and we're going to get the quality we want, which is exciting. So it means we can basically ship it very fast. The only reason I can't give an exact shipping date is we don't know how many stretch goals we're going to hit and how much other cool stuff we're going to build into it. So we want to make sure we have that.
I wasn't trying to say you could say it's but is it like, oh no, we hope to be within 6 months?
Oh yeah, we're hoping to be very fast.
Like how long does the campaign run for?
So the campaign we're going to run for about a month, right? We're still working exact details, but we're going to launch it for about a month starting next month, right? So starting again in end of September, early October this year. And then we would hope that we would ship it, we would produce and ship pretty rapidly after that. So we're not talking years and years. We're talking inside the first year, probably inside much sooner than that, once we get exactly knowing what the Kickstarter.
So once you know what the numbers are, and what the stretch
once you know the numbers are, the
and
stretch
stuff.
goals and all, and additional stuff, we'll get ideas too from people who are pledging for other things, and so we'll want to be able to respond to that. And so if we put a date in now, it would kind of lock us in.
No, that's what I was looking
Yeah,
for.
so I want to make sure
Is
we
this
can
a
be
coffin box size game, or more the square size?
It's going to be a little. I think it's the only thing we haven't nailed down yet is the box. So and the rule book. So we're still finalizing those two things, and I think we did that in the right order because you iterate on the rules, and so you don't want to be too locked in your rule set to the end. Similar with the box, we were iterating on the kinds of components. Like we ended up. Each of the hero players has a mat, and we ended up going with neoprene mats in the core game, which I'm very excited about. And that changes the box size as well. We want the box to be part of the game mechanics, and so as we design these things, that's what comes last. So
the box is part of the game mechanics.
Yeah, so for the Grimdark Dungeon Master, the Grimdark Dungeon Master has a set of tiles that become the dungeon, right? And we want the Grimdark Dungeon Master to have some flexibility in which tiles he or she plays, but we also want it to be a little bit random so they can't completely control it, which means basically they have stacks of tiles they're picking from. Those stacks have to be screened from the hero players. And we thought, wouldn't it be cool if the box lid popped up and the Grimdark Dungeon Master's Dungeon Master screen, if you will, was actually the box.
That's slick,
right? And so that's why the box
a trifold.
We don't know. We're still working on some ideas. There's some really cool ideas being thrown around with. I don't want to spoil anything.
Okay.
So the box is going to be unique, but it's not going to be giant. It's going to be a good size.
Yeah.
But it won't be like Coffin's box size. But it'll be.
All right. Did you nerd out since you're a box control freak? Is it also going to be like Nirvana for box
so
control?
We've had very serious discussions about how the box is going to work.
What's that thing? It's ASMR. That's the audio version. Is this going to be the visual version?
It's OCD. It's gamer OCD. I want my gamer stuff.
OCD.
Yeah. So yes. So I'm a huge fan of box control. The rulebook's going to be short. It's definitely going to have an index table of contents and full color. That's already happened.
Have that.
but
if you didn't have that,
even if it was a 4-page pamphlet, there would be a 5th page that is a table of contents and the index.
For those listeners just joining us, that was always one of
that
our
is
beefs.
happening. I don't care how short this thing is.
That was always one of our beefs for any listeners just joining. Back in the D6G, if Russ was reviewing a game and he's like, I don't understand why this rule book wouldn't have an index or a table of contents.
I really want to get a grease pencil in there, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Oh my gosh, you should. That should be a Gamefound, like the highest pledge.
That should be a stretch goal. Every box gets a grease pencil.
Maybe not the highest pledge. Maybe just
that should be
in there.
That should be the thing for early bird adopters. You get a free grease pencil.
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but what is exciting about it is, yes. So actually, I forgot the question. I got so excited about grease pencils.
We were nerding out over the box control.
Oh yes. So I really want the box control to be good. I would like to get to a place, and we're still figuring out the exact details, where you essentially open the box and it's pretty much ready to play, and everything is there's no sorting to do or anything else. They'll basically be doling out the hero stuff to each hero player, and then shuffling the tile stacks, of which there are 3 for the Grimdark Dungeon Master, and then you're pretty much ready to go. And that's how I want it to be. So for that to really be true, the box control has to be really good. And I even want, like, there's a bunch of different standees and or models, and we'll talk about those because they're very unique. Don't think, when I say standees, don't think cardboard. Think clear acrylic, full color kind of stuff. But there's a bunch of little monsters that the Grimdark Dungeon Master controls, obviously. And there's different kinds of monsters that he can spawn and summon, or she can spawn and summon throughout the course of the game. And so the idea is that all has to be organized in the box too. So I don't want people to be searching through piles of stuff. I want it to be just you open it up and you can go.
I'm excited for that.
And that's why the game isn't like thousands and thousands of components to make it accessible. It's not overwhelming. Hopefully it's not intimidating. But I really want it to be because we've done that with the design, I think it allows us to be much more well organized and be able to have the game fit neatly in the box. So I am very passionate about the game fitting in one box, not having multiple boxes on your shelves. There will be stretch goals that add
there'll be
miniatures and stuff
and booster packs.
Will take you to crazy levels. But the core set, I want it to be easy to manage, easy to store. You grab the box, you go, you pop it open, you play with your friends, and you save so much time in setup and teardown that you're like, let's quick play another game.
Now, that's what I was going to ask you. How long is a single session on average with players that have played?
So with 4 players, it's about an hour. It can be less than now. There is opening for analysis paralysis. I don't think there's a lot of decision making. It's really more player interaction.
That almost seems too quick to me.
Well, but we want it to be very accessible. Now there's a couple of expansions we're thinking about, and again, I don't want to share too much, but that will allow the dungeons to become bigger and play longer. So we want the most basic version though goes between 45 minutes and 90 minutes are what the game times are normally seeing, depending on if you're teaching it and everything else. But what ends up happening is we still play for 2 or 3 hours, just play again. And the other thing that's fun is, because the roles are so different, everybody rotates seats.
Oh, I was about to say, when you play again... Okay, pause. Not literal pause. Do you have... Is a campaign already in place?
In the core game...
Like a Descent?
No, in the core game, there's no campaign mode.
Okay.
But because the dungeon builds differently every time, every game is different. And because each hero plays so differently, and the Grim Dark Dungeon Master plays so differently, it's a new experience just to switch seats.
Now I'm curious. Because normally what's fun about these dungeon crawl games, as you know, is the character getting abilities over time. And I'm sure you've envisioned
one of the expansions we're looking at will have campaign options. That will do that. So the hero's powers will grow over time. The Grim Dark Dungeon Master's options will expand over time.
What had you decide as a designer? Gotta wear that mantle now.
Yeah.
What had you decide as a designer? You're like, you know what? I'm not going to start there. I want the game to be, you play your character, it's got its things, and then you play a different character next time if you want.
I wanted it to be quick and accessible. So I think one of the things about campaign games...
Why was that so... Oh, you're about to answer.
Well, one of the things about campaign games is people look at campaign games. When you open a campaign game and you see that the coolest parts of the game is the 5th or 6th or 7th play you get with the same people playing, and you realize your gaming group doesn't get together that often, you look at that game and go, that's an awesome concept. I'm never going to get the full value.
That actually happened to me.
Right? So what I wanted the game to be is, actually, you can have a dungeon crawling moment with your friends. You can have a one-shot like you do in D&D. You can have a one-shot. You can have a 2 or 3 shot. And if you like it and you want to do more later, you can. And you can mix things up and around, but you're not committing to a long saga. Now, if you want a long saga, we will have expansions that will let you do that. But I really wanted this idea that you can just, it can be almost a filler game, but it can also be a really meaty tactical experience that you get very serious about beating your opponent, over and over again, or a certain way, or you're thinking, man, I always win as the berserker dwarf or the barbarian dwarf, but I never ever win as the Grim Dark Dungeon Master when Raef plays the Templar. Because whenever Raef plays the Templar, I get my butt kicked, and like that's the kind of competitiveness I want. It's like
neat.
You can play War Machine in the campaign, but you can also play War Machine head to head and start to learn about certain combos that you like and you want to be able to beat. Okay. So I wanted that feeling of like, it's a dungeon crawling game, but it's a competitive game that has a lot of aspects to it that no 2 plays are the same. And so even though it's a dungeon crawling game, your first thought isn't, how does this turn into a campaign? Your first thought is, man, that was interesting. How could it play differently next time? How do I overcome that particular challenge? That was an interesting technique the Grim Dark Dungeon Master pulled off, or that particular way he designed that hallway. Next time I'm going to behave differently so he or she can't design the hallway that way.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about the gameplay a little bit.
Yeah.
We got these neoprene mats, and they're the character.
Mm-hmm.
Am I putting cards that are my character on the neoprene mat?
Yeah. So the main components of the game, the Grim Dark Dungeon Master has a set of dungeon tiles, which are heavy, beautifully full-colored cardstock, and they fall into 3 major categories of groups. And for lack of better terms, there's the red stack, the yellow stack, and the green stack, right? So these are different sort of themes for the dungeon that all come together to form the single dungeon you're building.
Are these puzzle pieces, or are they just...
No, they're just squares that just go together next to each other.
Okay.
The reason we did that, when you start to play, you sort of see why this is. It gives the gameplay more flexibility. And then each hero player has and then the neoprene mats came later. What core to the hero player is, each hero player has a hand of cards. It's not a deck, so they own all their cards from the beginning of the game, and there are 6 cards. And these 6 cards represent different actions. And during your turn, you can do a basic action with your hero, which is move, attack with your weapon. And then you can also play one of your cards. When you play one of your cards, you play it down to your mat. And this card does 2 things when you play it down face up to your mat. The first thing it does is there's an action on the top of the card that you do immediately. right? It could be a certain kind of spell you're casting. It could be an extra movement you get. It could be swinging your axe in a circle that attacks all enemies on your dungeon tile, whatever. The second part of the card, though, is a passive permanent effect that's in effect as long as the card is face up on your mat. So it might be, the way to think about this is the Templar who is literally, think of Knights Templar, right? He's got a big shield, he's got a sword, and he might be like Shielded Advance might be his move, which gets him to move an extra square. But also the persistent effect on the bottom of the card is all heroes on his tile are +1 defense die. So that the fluff is he's got his shield up and he's blocking for you and he's at a certain stance. And so the rest of the heroes, while they're near him, get extra defenses just for him doing that, right?
That's cool.
And maybe the spellcaster has similar abilities that maybe like repel magic better or things like that, right? And so when you're playing these cards, you're deciding that. Now, as you play the cards, what the mats are doing for you is two things. One, they have slots on them to tell you where to play the card. So as you play cards down, you're playing more cards down to the right. And then also in a certain slot of the mat, there is a permanent passive ability that your hero always has that's always in effect.
Cool.
However, when that gets covered up by a card, it goes away.
Aha.
So your hero sort of gets tired over time, and you have to rest to get that ability back. And so, and the way you rest, one of your cards is the rest card, which lets you get all your cards back. And so what's happening is you're putting cards down to do specific special moves and also create persistent abilities, but you have to balance how many persistent abilities are you trying to stack before you want to rest to get all your cards back to be able to do those abilities again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Okay. Well, let's talk about the characters. What are the character choices?
So in the core game, now we've already thought about, I can't reveal them all here on the show, but we've already thought about the first expansion, which is going to add 3 more heroes to the game. So keep an eye on the Gamefound for that. But in the core game, there are 3 heroes. There is a Knight Templar, who is basically shield and sword, full armor, classic looking dude, and you'll see all the art. There is a Barbarian Dwarf, who has a hammer and throwing axes, and this is a lot of fun. So we had to, I wanted all the rules to be very. One of my design requirements, and you know about this, Raef, we've talked about it in the past, is I want the rules to capture the theme, and the theme to capture the rules. So one of the things I was very insistent upon was, as the artist was thinking about how to draw, let's say, the Dwarf Barbarian, and the person who was doing our stories was thinking about the story of the Dwarf Barbarian, I asked, like, okay, what kind of weapons does a dwarf have? Well, he has a giant double-handed, double-bladed battle axe, and he also has a big hammer. But then he also has a bunch of throwing axes. I'm like, okay, well, he can have an ability then that lets him attack people far away throwing his axes. He can have a special move with his hammer. He can have a special move with his bladed axe, right? He's a barbarian, so that should imply certain things. So I really wanted those abilities to tie to the fluff and the story and the art of the character. I didn't want it to just be every hero's the same, right? Templar similar. We're really leaning to his shield. We're really leaning into his holiness. And then the third person is a mage in the first game. So the third person is an elven mage, and his big thing is he has this cool magical staff that does a bunch of stuff, and then of course he also can cast a few cool spells. And the other big mechanic in the game that we haven't talked about a little bit is all the dungeon tiles are double-sided. And the reason they are double-sided is one side of the tile is sort of the what we call the active side of the tile. It's the side that's infused with evil, and the Grimdark Dungeon Master is getting an ability for that part of the tile.
Huh.
So in the Grimdark Dungeon Master's turn, he or she looks out at the table, all the tiles that are face up, and one of the things they can do is activate any of those tiles. And all the tiles have special abilities on them, or many of them do, that allow the Grimdark Dungeon Master to do certain things, like spawn some skeletons over there, or move one of your minions 2 squares, or whatever. However, the heroes can purge these tiles. They can purify them, essentially, and that flips them over from the active side to the purge side, which removes the Grimdark Dungeon Master some of his or her abilities, and sometimes even gives the heroes a boon, for example. That's something they can use when they're on that tile or near the tile or whatever. So that's important because some of the heroes are better at purging. And they're better at purging certain types of tiles. So the wizard, for example, is really good at purging magical related tiles, right? He's got a dispel magic action that can actually make it easier to purge certain tiles. What other heroes are better at purging other tiles, like the Templar is pretty good at purging undead tiles, for example. So It allowed me to have these other ancillary abilities, like exploring and other things that are beyond just combat. So one of the things to think about in this game is, and this is where the competitive dungeon building comes in, one of the Templar's abilities is he can detect evil. And when the Templar detects evil, he can immediately force the Grimdark Dungeon Master to play 3 tiles from the top of each of his stacks. And they have to be near where the Templar is currently standing. So normally what's happening is the Grimdark Dungeon Master is building the dungeon in their own way, and each turn they're laying down a different tile and putting it where they want. Mm-hmm. But when the heroes do certain powers, they can force the Grimdark Dungeon Master to put tiles near the hero, and sometimes it could be a tile you don't want near the hero, like one of your objectives. And so this is where the competitive dungeon building comes in. There's more than just walk around the dungeon, explore, and kill monsters.
Kill skeletons.
You as a hero player are actually influencing how fast the dungeon is being built, where certain rooms are going to be. Some of the tiles, when you purge them and you flip them over, on the hallway tiles on the back there is a big arrow, and the hero player who flips that over can determine which way that arrow faces. And these arrows then are pointing to key objective rooms that are somewhere in the dungeon. And so when the Grimdark Dungeon Master eventually places that room, he has to look out and make sure the room is obeying all the currently face-up arrows. So basically the heroes can force certain objectives to be in certain places. And they can force the objectives to be co-located, so the Grimdark Dungeon Master can't put one thing way over on one side of the dungeon, another thing on the other side of the dungeon. So the idea is to really force that. Does that make sense? I know I'm doing
it makes a lot of sense, actually, even to my non-engineer brain.
And you were just asking a simple question like, how are the heroes different? But you have to...
I gotcha.
Part of it's how the dungeon works for the heroes.
So let's go back to the heroes.
Yeah.
In the core game now, I'm imagining that you are probably already got an idea. Well, here's how I have ideas. Well, there's going to be additional things. There's going to be clerics. There's going to be hobbit archers, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. But
you're dangerously close to some of those ideas, by the way.
Well, I mean,
it's a fantasy game.
It's a fantasy game.
Right.
I'm imagining too that in the core game, each has just the one card set.
Yeah.
But in the future, there could be different card sets for that hero, right? But in the core game, is it just the one, or can I pick from 3?
In the core game, each hero has a set of the same 6 abilities for that hero, right? So the Templar's cards are all the same. The idea being that in future games, and also in the core game, there are 3 different tile stacks that the Grimdark Dungeon Master has access to that are always the same in the core game. With future expansions, the Grimdark Dungeon Master will be able to switch out entire tile stacks. Mm-hmm. So there could be a different green tile stack, which could be a completely different theme. So, for example, in the core game, it's all about the Necromancer, right? And so it's all undead. And in our first few expansions, we're thinking of sticking with the undead theme. So it would be, there might be, I can't share, but there might be whole stacks you change that would be different kinds of undead, for example.
Okay.
Let your imagination go that way. So for heroes, though, similarly, when we think about new heroes in expansions, they will come with their own sets of cards. They don't replace the current hero cards. There's a different hero with different abilities. But in the campaign version, we're thinking about, that's where I'm thinking about, well, maybe that shield block move I talked about earlier, maybe there's a new version of that.
Yeah,
that's a little more, that's leveled up. You get new decks, or you can replace certain cards.
Yeah.
And so we're thinking through some of that now. But yes, what's exciting about the mechanics and the way they were built is the game is very extensible. Like, it's all tile-driven and card-driven, meaning it's very easy. But there's a lot of cool components, as you'll see in a little bit. But at the end of the day, by simply changing the dungeon tiles that are involved and changing the hero power cards that are involved, you can give the game a lot of flexibility.
It's infinite.
Yeah,
infinite
exactly.
Playability. Exactly. Okay, how are we moving about the board? Are we using dice?
Good question. So the name of this podcast is the D6 generation. And so right off the bat, there had to be dice.
We're going to be playing with D12s.
And they're going to be D6s, and there's going to be dice. And I'm a big fan, as you know, of iconography on dice.
Yes,
meaning
you are.
I don't want tables, and you always hit on a 3+ or any of that kind of stuff. So the game comes with 2 sets of custom dice, but they're only used for combat. So movement is very tactical. There's no randomness to movement. However, with combat, and room purging is not automatic. So as I mentioned earlier, to flip those tiles over to purge, that involves dice rolling. And when the Grimdark Dungeon Master's minions attack, or the heroes attack those minions, those all involve dice rolling. And so there's 2 pools of dice. There's the blue defense dice, which have little shield symbols and different numbers on the sides. And there are red attack dice, which have little swords on sides. And so basically, when you're attacking or defending, you're rolling a pool of attack dice, counting up the swords. The defender's rolling a pool of defense dice, counting up the shields. If the swords beat the shields, you do a point of damage.
Okay, right? Do we have the types of D6s where certain colors have 1 shield on all faces, and the next color has 3 shields on one face?
So in the core game, all blue dice are identical, and all red dice are identical, meaning all the attack dice have the same number of swords, and all the blue dice have the same number of swords. However, in expansions, that may change, right? So we may come up with specialized dice that you roll in certain situations.
But does the barbarian get to roll more dice than the wizard?
So what happens is, and against certain enemies too. So all the enemies have type icons. And so remember those persistent effects I talked about earlier on the bottom of your cards? Some of those persistent effects are,
add
heroes,
shield dice, or
add shield dice, add attack
add
dice,
a sword dice.
right? So the idea is, let's say the barbarian's spinning his axe around and causing disruption for all the enemies nearby. Well, all heroes attacking enemies within a certain distance of the dwarf are +1 red die while that card's face up. So as long as the dwarf's not tired out and still doing that move. So what I was trying to capture with that was like the idea of stances, like the idea that heroes can have certain poses and be doing certain things that are persistent and helping the rest of the party out.
That's fun.
And one of the big parts of the game is you do need to work together as heroes, or otherwise Grimdark Dungeon Master, because
too powerful.
Well, and that's what I try to do, the one brain versus many game brain. If the heroes all play for themselves and ignore the fact that there's 3 versus 1, it's going to be a harder game for them. If they really think about working together and how to collaborate, and they talk a lot with each other and communicate a lot with each other and really think about their persistent abilities as they play, it becomes much harder for the Grimdark Dungeon Master.
Okay.
And so that's one of the tips. In fact, one of the things interesting about the game is I think it's almost better for inexperienced players in their first game to have the inexperienced person play the Grimdark Dungeon Master to give the other inexperienced players a better chance. Because if the super experienced players playing the Grimdark Dungeon Master and all your heroes are new players and they're not familiar with how well they work together, I think the Dungeon Master will have
an edge,
a little advantage.
That was one of my questions for you. Is one of the challenges, and you've heard us use this term, but again, you could be a newer listener coming into this, is the one brain versus many. So the traditional challenge of a dungeon crawl where you have a dungeon master, not a role-playing game, board game, is that you have 4 very experienced players, 4 very experienced tactical minds competing against your one mind. That was one of my questions for you. Is it sounds like you encountered that, so you don't have to be 4 times as smart or 4 times as good. It sounds like you put the power levels to help the dungeon master, the Grimdark Dungeon Master, not be one mind. Is that's accurate?
And so as the dungeon develops, because the dungeon master's abilities are literally on the table as it grows, right? So the hero's abilities are in this hand of cards they have, right? And each turn, they're going to take a basic action. Answer your question before I move around the dungeon. So during the hero's turn, they get a basic action and they play a card, right? Their basic action and there's a little reference card that tells you all this. So your basic action is basically move 1 tile or attack with your sword or your bow or whatever weapon you have. And then with the card, it could be similar. The card could be move again, or it could be a special kind of attack like chain lightning for the wizard, that kind of stuff. And then the card also tells you what chain lightning means. Like, roll this many dice against all the enemies on the next 3 tiles, and you can kind of like shoot lightning down the corridor and zap them all, hopefully is the plan, right? And so that's how the basic movement works. And the Grimdark Dungeon Master, so the hero's abilities are static, but as they play the cards, but what makes them interesting is how they handle their combos. So how they handle their persistent effects, how they stance themselves, or how they stand related to each other in the dungeon, and how those persistent effects buff each other. Whereas with the Grimdark Dungeon Master, what they're trying to do is get enough of the tiles that give them the cool powers face up on the dungeon at once, where all of a sudden they can start popping the right powers in the right order and really start messing the heroes up. So in the beginning of the game, the Grimdark Dungeon Master's options are very limited, but as the dungeon grows, so too does their power. And if the heroes neglect to purge the dungeon and neglect to clean things up and just race to find the objective and leave their rear undefended, they will be letting the Grimdark Dungeon Master be able to get them from all the different angles and maybe get them in a bit of trouble.
Okay.
And so that's how I think, but you tell me after you play it, that's how I think that the Grimdark Dungeon Master has the ability to handle the fact that there are so many players on the table.
Okay. This is just in my mind. When the DM's flipping tiles, are any of them traps? Where you get to be like, haha, pit trap.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, exactly that.
That's fun.
So one of the things the heroes can do is when you're standing on one of these tiles, right? There's 4 doors on every tile. So the heroes can go in any of 4 directions. Now, the heroes, one of their actions can be to walk, and they can walk from a tile that's already face up to another adjacent tile that's face up, or they can walk through an unexplored door. And when they do this, the Dungeon Master has to immediately play a tile there. So this is a way they can quickly force the Dungeon Master to put tiles out too, without using special abilities like Detect Evil that I mentioned earlier. But the Grimdark Dungeon Master could put a tile out that is in fact a trap, right? And that tile could then immediately hurt that hero or set the hero up for being hurt later. And so there's risk to the heroes for walking in an unexplored area. But the Grimdark Dungeon Master, he has essentially behind that screen, behind that box that I mentioned that's going to be the screen, he or she's got 3 stacks of tiles. And they're pre-shuffled. So all the Dungeon Master knows at this moment is when they're looking at the top of those tiles, all they know is the top option for each tile stack. So they may not have a trap available right now. Oh. And so they're kind of, it's not like they're having the whole deck in front of them. They have sort of 3 decks with the top card revealed from each, and they can choose from that. So the heroes can be like, well, a trap just popped. Do we think another one's going to pop? Or do you think now we can all start running in different directions and force the Grimdark Dungeon Master to put down one of those cool objective tiles they were trying to get to win the game? Because somewhere in those 3 stacks is an objective tile in each stack. Right, so eventually what you're trying to do is get the Dungeon Master to put those cool objective rooms out so you can purge them and win the game. That's how the heroes win.
Okay, all right. I'm just now noticing that in typical Raef fashion, I haven't even asked how to win. It's always like just how to play. And I have more questions on how to play.
Yeah,
all right. So I'm really getting excited to check it out.
I'm curious. Is this intriguing, or are you like,
yeah,
oh my god?
No, this sounds awesome. If I was hearing a complete stranger, I want to play.
Because you guys are hearing like me tell this to Raef for literally the first time.
Literally the first time. I know nothing.
And so I'm telling him all this, and I'm excited about it.
Sounds fun.
But I don't know if you're excited about it.
Yeah, no, it sounds awesome. All right. Let's go to your creative side a little bit here. How did you, 2 creative questions, when approached with this, did all of those ideas of like that you shared in the beginning come like instantly to your brain? Or did that happen over time? Where you're like, I love the one versus the many, but I also want to make it more powerful, but I also wanted to, have a story and not be known. Did that all just go like a flash? You knew that, and then you built everything from there? Or describe how it came to you.
So the idea of a one versus many dungeon crawl was something I wanted to do because I just thought, well, if I'm going to design the game, I want to design my favorite genre. Because I knew it was going to be a lot of work. And so I wanted to do something I was passionate about. And then it also has really bothered me that pretty much all the classic one versus many dungeon crawls have all become pure co-ops, right? And I think we can blame Gloomhaven for this. And I'm not trying to pick on Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven is an awesome game because when it came out, it was did really well, and was a full co-op. Pretty much everybody's converted all their dungeon crawlers to full co-op.
Like, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Descent has it. Yeah, the new version of Descent is full co-op. It's got a little app, and so for me that the fun goes away. Like for me personally. Now, I know people love full co-op games. Nothing wrong with full co-op games. There's plenty of them.
Just like there's nothing wrong with medieval farming games. Now you finally
There's nothing wrong with medieval farming games. It's just not my cup of tea. So I would not design a medieval farming game, even though it might be really interesting and challenging to do so. So I was like, well, I want it to be one versus many dungeon crawl. The other design constraint that was initially in the game that later went away was we wanted the initial version we were thinking about. We had this idea for 3 hero models, but we also wanted it to be very affordable. So the original idea was let's make this like a very affordable, like $20 or $30 price point game, right? And so with that, we were like, well, we'll have cool art, but what if the tiles were the game for the dungeon part? And what if the monsters in the dungeon were just art on the tiles? And then I was thinking, well, then if you flip them over, on the other side of the tile would be just dead monsters, right? So the idea was you'd see the tile, oh, it's a bunch of orcs, right? And then the party would attack the tile, and then you'd flip the tile over to be a bunch of dead orcs. And that was the idea. Initial version of the game was sort of that. And as we progressed a little more, the folks behind manufacturing were like, I think you've got a real game here. But I want the models, the orcs to move around. I want there to be monster models. How can we do that? And so that's where we started thinking about, well, what if instead of those tiles being, where the actual monsters, what if they were spawn rooms that generated monsters, and the Grimdark Dungeon Master has in their box like a little pile of monsters that they can actually put on those. And what if the different spawning rooms created different kinds of monsters? So in the core game, there are cultists. There are 2 kinds of undead skeletons. There's all skeletons are undead, but 2 types of undead. There are archers. There are skeletal archers, and there are skeletal sword and shield guys, and their stats are a little different. And then in addition to that, there is the main bad guy who is a necromancer. Right?
Okay.
He's also a model. And so the idea was if I could spawn those, then I would need mechanics for the Grimdark Dungeon Master to move them around the dungeon. And so that happens now. And so now what's interesting is you can purge the room, which stops them from spawning more dudes, but you still got to kill the dudes the room spawned, which is sort of interesting as well. So I think so that's sort of how it to answer your question. There was initially a design constraint that created the interesting mechanic of the tiles. The arrows. So initially there were no arrows. So initially, meaning I think I mentioned this earlier briefly, right? So a lot of the goal of the heroes is to find and purge certain objectives. And there's an objective tile on each of the 3 tile stacks I mentioned, right? Now, one of the objective tiles is the main boss bad guy. And if you purge the necromancer, and if you beat him by himself, you win the whole game. So you can either find the red objective and win the whole game, or you can find the yellow and green objectives and win the second. So one of those is like one of the objects you need to get, and one of them is a ritual chamber that's powering the necromancer's evil plan. And so basically, if you stop his evil plan and grab his magical artifact, that's a win because you stop his plan, or you can just go kill him outright, which may be a little harder,
Yeah.
And so what I figured out, though, in a few early play tests was the heroes didn't know where to go. Like, there wasn't a pressing way to figure out the direction, know where to go. And because there was already this purge mechanic, so initially the hallways, there was no reason to purge a hall. So there's some tiles that are halls, and there's nothing on the other side. It's just a hallway. And you're trying to find the objectives or the monsters to purge them or the spawning points. And I realized, well, wait a minute, if the hallways could be purged to show you a direction, which is with the arrows, then it'll tell the heroes where to go. And wouldn't it be cool if the heroes could actually pick the direction? So now the heroes are controlling the growth of the dungeon. And that's where the competitive dungeon building game part of it started to come from, is we realized, holy crap. And it was one of the very early play tests where the person said, you've created a competitive dungeon building game between the Grimdark Dungeon Master and the heroes, and the fighting is just a side part. And it was sort of like, oh yeah, that's what we did. So I'd love to say that it was like, I woke up one night and this entire thing was in my head. That's not how it happens. And I think that, we've interviewed a lot of game designers on the show, and it's similar, right? Where people tell these stories of it started one way and then we iterated. I would say the core mechanics that stayed the same the entire time. The flipping over of the tiles, the purged and unpurged side, that was core to it. And the hero cards having persistent effects, because I really like the idea of the heroes having battle stances. Mm-hmm. The other thing I didn't mention is how wounding works. So there's no hit points in the game. How it works is when the heroes damage a minion, a monster, a model on the game board, you remove it. So the models have no hit points. They have defense dice, and if you penetrate their defense dice, they're removed from the table. The heroes, if they take a wound, remember I mentioned there's that hero mat, and on the hero mat, they have face-up cards, right? If you take a wound, you have to take one of your cards and put it face down. So what does that do? It removes one of the moves you can do, because now you've lost it. And because it's face down, its persistent effect goes away. Oh. So you're having what I used to call on the show battlefield degradation, right? As you take wounds as a hero, you have less options and you're helping your friendly heroes less. One of the early designs initially was, and the way you win the game as the Grimdark Dungeon Master, is you get one hero's all their cards flipped face down. So you get all 6 cards face down, the hero is air quotes dead, and the Grimdark Dungeon Master wins. Turns out that is not at all fun.
Yeah, that's not fun because you're just going to zero in on
You're zeroing on one hero, and that poor hero, as they take more and more wounds, they can do less and less, and that player is miserable. So instead, we pivoted slightly, and we said as soon as there are 6 wounds amongst all of the heroes,
I like that.
The Grimdark Dungeon Master wins. And the story is the heroes are so badly wounded and so overwhelmed, they decide to withdraw and try again later. Right? They escape, they run away. So, although our guy running the story is like, these heroes would never run away. Just call it like they withdraw with purpose. I'm like, okay, but they basically they run away. They withdraw with purpose. They withdraw with purpose. So, but in any case, what made that really cool? A, it was more fun for the Grimdark Dungeon Master to spread the wounds out. But B, it gets interesting because the heroes always have options, and then C, even when they're getting wounded, it's actually beneficial for the Grimdark Dungeon Master to spread the wounds out, because when healing happens, and there are healing abilities to flip the cards back over, the heroes, if you all wounded the same hero, you can easily just heal that one hero up. By spreading it out, it takes more heal actions to do that, and more resting, and so the Dungeon Master is more incentivized to actually spread the wounds out, and certain characters have different kinds of buffs. So if the Grimdark Dungeon Master is trying to reduce the overall effectiveness of the party, spreading the wounds out works better too. So what made the game more fun actually made it a more tactical game as well, which is kind of a neat discovery.
That's neat. Are the heroes going through the rooms and discovering any kind of loot? Heal potions, scrolls?
Sort of. So there's no equipment, or again, we're trying to keep it very simple and accessible. Although in future iterations of the game, I could see a lot of this stuff coming into play. Maybe some of the cards become equipment that you put in the hero's hands, that kind of thing. But the way it works, there are, as I mentioned before, there are some rooms that become boons for heroes. Yep. So when you purge some of the rooms, here's a good example. So one of the rooms is a force cage room. So remember you mentioned a trap. So when you step onto a force cage room, and the card's got this cool art of like electrical lightning going around the edge of the room, the hero, this is a fun example too. Originally, the original version of that room was the hero couldn't leave the tile until the tile was purged. And so the hero could try to purge it, but if the dwarf barbarian, and the force cage is a magical room, so the dwarf barbarian is terrible at purging magic, for example. So the elf would have to go help him out. They can get lucky, but So what ended up happening was we actually had one game where the very first step the first hero took was the force cage, and he got trapped. And then the elf's like, no problem, I can help you. I'll step in there too. And he just couldn't roll to get out. And then the Templar's like, no problem, I'll come help you. And he couldn't get out. And all the heroes died in the force trap. And because what's interesting is during the Dungeon Master's turn, there's an action the Dungeon Master can take to electrify everybody in a force cage. So they just died. And we're like, that was hilarious, but also kind of crappy.
Well,
but
it sometimes happens.
It was hilarious. It was pretty hilarious.
Like magic, that can happen.
So what we ended up doing instead was, but you couldn't leave. And so what ended up happening was during your turn, you could get frustrated because if a character got stuck in a force cage and they couldn't get out. So what we decided to do instead was, if you leave a force cage, you can do it. You just take heavy damage. And so now the hero can decide, do I want to stay trapped and maybe not take any wounds because the party can't afford any more wounds right now, or roll to purge it, or do I try to run through the electricity, take the damage, and suck it up? So which is a little more tactical option.
More tactical, yeah.
But what's interesting about this, back to your question, if you purge the force cage room and flip it over, the other side is a teleportation circle.
Aha!
And if any two force cages have been flipped to teleportation circles, as a move action, a hero can move from one of those teleportation circles to another.
That's clever.
So there's an example of a boon, right? So now by purging these rooms, the heroes can teleport around the dungeon more effectively to find those objectives.
Okay.
So that's a good example. There are other things, like some of the objectives that you can capture but don't quite win the game yet, turn into healing pools and things like that. So there are parts of the dungeon that become good.
That are like loot.
And so it's kind of like a story in that by purging sections of the dungeon. Yes.
Okay. Few more design questions, and then we'll either play or you'll show me components.
Yeah, sure.
Did you, let's talk about the creative design part of it again. How long would you say you scratched this out on paper or computer and then figured it out by playing? Or did you have the whole thing, well, as far as the first iteration, all mapped out on paper, and then you play tested?
So
like, what was your creative process like?
I really wanted to, so in my real life job, I'm a product manager, right? And so one of the tenets of product management is you test early with your clients and then iterate.
Smart.
So I figured that would work in gaming. And I know a lot of game designers who do this, so it's not exactly rocket science, but I decided I wanted to do that. So I built up, so the very first thing I did was when I had this idea, I ended up, so there's a funny story about this. So I had, we have this train lying around because we're gamers, and I have all these cardboard tiles for various sort of build your own dungeon stuff for various things. And so I took my camera out and I took pictures of various rooms that I would want to put in the game I was designing, and I just threw terrain on it like I would. And I took pictures of it. Here's a room with some tables in it. Here's a room with some barrels in it. Here's a room with a treasure room in it. I took pictures of this, and then I put it all in PowerPoint, and I laid it all out as if it was tiles, and then I printed them all, cut them out, and put them in square card sleeves.
Neat.
And this created the tiles, right? And I play tested it almost immediately just by myself, and then I started to take it to the people who had the idea and play test it with them. And then actually at one point I took it to Gen Con and play tested it with a couple of people privately who also designed games. And they were the ones that gave me the feedback on like the arrows and stuff. I came up with the arrows afterwards, but they gave me the feedback like, hey, we don't know where to go. I don't know what my objective is. I mean, I know I have to get this objective. I don't know where. I don't have any reason to go left or right, for example. So that was really good. And so I really started play testing it right off the bat that way. And I started to iterate very rapidly from that. And the way I did the rules was I didn't want to write the whole rule book and have to redo it, because another tenet of product management is the more you invest in long-range planning, the more psychologically you're against change. And you really want to be in a psychological place where you welcome change and you welcome feedback and you iterate rapidly.
It's a neat little tip.
And so for the rules, instead of writing a big rule book, I wrote a bunch of quick reference cards that I would hope, if you had all those in front of you, basically told you the rules. And that allowed me to rapidly change those quick reference cards, right? So if we decided that the hero should have 2 basic actions instead of 1, or a basic action should include attack, which eventually it did. Initially, all the hero could do was make a step and play a card. And now it's a basic action, which is attack, step, or card, right? And we can talk about that after you play the game to see if that was a good idea or not. but basically, that was sort of the thinking, was like, I want to be able to iterate rapidly, and all I got to do is print out these new quick reference cards and sleeve them So I print them out, stick them in a hard plastic card sleeve, and be like, "Here's how you play." Does that answer your question?
Yep. A lot of the more design questions. The game master has certain AI that they have to follow. Like the skeletons have to move towards this and towards that, and that can get pretty finicky. It's now dawning on me that that's completely obviated by your tile flipping method.
So two things about that. I did toy with the idea that the grim dark dungeon master. So in the initial version of the game, remember there were no models. So in the initial version of the game, the monsters didn't leave their rooms. But you'd flip a tile over and it'd be like skeletal archers, and they can and you can activate that tile and attack a hero in a straight line from that tile. So basically, the skeleton would shoot down the corridor, right? And then I realized, well, that's cool, but we wanted to make models. And my initial reaction to that was, we'll create spawn points, and the models will move on their own. And then I realized one of my other design requirements was I wanted all the rules to fit on these cards. Like, I didn't want to have a game where I needed a giant thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't want a deck of cards for monster mechanics. I was like, man, if the monsters... And then I was like, wait a minute. What if during the Grim Dark Dungeon Master's turn, like the heroes perform a basic action and they play a card. What if the Grim Dark Dungeon Master, what if they could either use a power on a tile, which is how they used to be. The Grim Dark Dungeon Master originally is you play a new tile and you activate an existing tile, right? But now, the Grim Dark Dungeon Master's action is you can take a minion action, which is basically move some models or attack with some models, or play a tile, or activate a tile. And that was interesting because one of the big changes we made to make the game scale was how the Grim Dark Dungeon Master activates. So originally, it was the hero players go and then the Grim Dark Dungeon Master goes. But now it's a hero player takes an action, the Grim Dark Dungeon Master takes an action. Then the next hero player takes an action, then the Grim Dark Dungeon Master takes an action. And so the Grim Dark Dungeon Master can only do one action during his or her turn, but they go after every single player. So in a heads-up game, you go, I go, you go, I go, you go, I go, that's fine. But in a 3 versus 1 game, you go, I go, next player goes, I go, next, and that also helps the many versus one brain thing.
That helps the many versus one.
Because the Grim Dark Dungeon Master he only has one small action, but he has a chance to quickly react after each hero goes, which can be very interesting, right? And the other thing that's kind of interesting is when you go, let's say, Raef, you're playing the Templar and you go, and let's say Craig and Seppi from the podcast, from our D&D game, are also playing the game. So you would get to go, I would get to go, Joe would get to go, I'm the Grim Dark Dungeon Master, I get to go, and then Seppi goes and the Grim Dark Dungeon Master goes, then it's your turn again. What that means is, after you go, Raef, the Dungeon Master is going to get 3 turns before you, Raef, get to go again.
Right.
So your other hero players better do something to distract him, or the Grim Dark Dungeon Master is going to get a 3-action setup before you get to go again, and maybe able to hammer the heck out of your hero. So for example, if your action states had you pop a room up and you're standing right in front of a room chock full of undead archers, the Grim Dark Dungeon Master can be like, my archers fire at Raef! My archers fire at Raef! My archers fire at Raef! And if none of those other heroes do anything to distract the Grim Dark Dungeon Master, you're going to have that problem. But in head-to-heads play, it's also a problem. Because in heads-up play, you go,
I go again.
I reveal the skeletons, you go again and jump out of the way,
That's brilliant.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Last question before we play.
Yeah.
Do you want to show me components before I play, or do you want to pause the recording and we play and we talk about components afterwards?
Well, let's think about this. So normally, let me do this. Normally, the way a real game works, right, is we would buy the game.
Yes.
We may have read about the game on the back of the box. We may have seen the website. We may have heard a podcast about it, not like now. And so we're excited to play the game. But then we open it, or like convention, we would see the components too, which would also get us excited.
Yep.
So we're at this moment, having not seen the components. How would you rate your desire to play the game?
10.
10. Okay. All right. So
that's
now
an honest review.
All right, good. Well, that's out of 100 or out of 10?
Out of 10.
Okay,
it sounds Raef-like. It doesn't sound too complicated.
Yeah.
It sounds like I'm going to get some fun. I get to play some traditional fantasy. I really want to see this flipping. It got some new mechanics. So if you were some,
you tell me if they're innovative or not. I feel like I can't call them as innovative.
I think they're definitely innovative. Right. So if you were some stranger that I met at Gen Con, I'd be like, I want to.
Stay tuned for part 2 of the Grim Dark Dungeon Master interview, in which we'll get Raef's reaction to the components and his thoughts after his first play of the game. For more information on Grim Dark Dungeon Master, you can head over to grimdarkdungeonmaster.com or just go directly to Gamefound and search for Grim Dark Dungeon Master. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.
Achievement unlocked! You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@the d6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.